So I want you to imagine this vast, incredibly powerful river. Like it is completely polluted, just churning with debris, and the current is terrifyingly fast.
Okay, that is a pretty vivid picture.
Right. And right now, if you are a medical student prepping for your exams, or maybe a junior doctor running the wards, or really any practicing clinician, you are stationed at the river delta.
Yeah, we are all standing at the very end of this massive water system.
Exactly. And our daily reality basically consists of pulling drowning, battered, bleeding people out of the water. We are frantically triaging them.
Oh, absolutely. Setting fractured mandibles, stitching up lacerations.
Yeah, prescribing antiretrovirals, treating their acute, immediate trauma.
Yeah,
And let's be honest, modern clinical medicine is exceptionally good at doing exactly that.
it really is. We are world class at that Delta level trauma care. But I mean, the tragic reality of clinical practice is that the river just keeps bringing more people.
It never stops.
Right. You finish a grueling 12-hour shift in the emergency department, you've patched up a dozen people, and the moment you hand over your pager, the waiting room is full again.
Just an endless, exhausting flow of human trauma.
Exactly. And this is exactly where the discipline of public health has to step in and fundamentally change the paradigm. Public health looks at that endless flow of broken bodies at the Delta and asks a terrifying, completely different question.
Which is what?
Who is systematically throwing these people into the river upstream?
Oh, man, I love that framing. But I have to say, it is a really tough pivot to make clinically.
It is, yeah.
Because when you have an actively bleeding patient right in front of you, treating violence as this epidemiological phenomenon feels incredibly abstract.
It feels totally disconnected from the visceral reality of the trauma, Bay.
Right. We are socially conditioned to view violence like an unpredictable natural disaster. We treat it like a lightning strike.
Someone gets hurt, they end up in the ER, the police are called, and we view it as this tragic, isolated, random event.
Or, alternatively, we view it purely as a moral or criminal failing of one bad apple.
Right. But what we are going to explore today in this deep dive is that violence is absolutely not a natural disaster. It is a structurally engineered flaw in our social ecology.
And that is the exact conceptual leap we are asking you to make today. This deep dive mirrors Chapter 9.5 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health.
Specifically, the section coded GPH 84, Interpersonal Violence, which was authored by Rachel Jukes.
Right. And our mission here is to move entirely beyond the standard moral or purely psychological or even the criminal justice framing of violence.
We are going to map it as a patterned, predictable, and most importantly, inherently preventable epidemiological phenomenon. We are looking at the upstream engineering.
Now, before we really start mapping this river,
Yeah.
I do need to give you a quick but absolutely crucial disclaimer.
Yeah, this is important.
Because as a clinician, you know that patients don't exist in a political vacuum, right? And neither does public health data.
Yeah, no, it definitely doesn't.
This textbook chapter covers some inherently deeply politically charged territories. We're going to be forced to look at the epidemiological data surrounding things like firearms legislation, patriarchal gender theories, systemic wealth inequality, and deeply ingrained cultural norms.
Which can be a lot to navigate.
It is. So I want to be very clear that our role today is not to advocate for a specific political platform or take a side on these cultural flashpoints.
Not at all. Our job is to impartially, rigorously unpack the academic frameworks and the epidemiological data exactly as they are presented in the source material.
Exactly. We want to give you the objective, clinical, and systemic reasoning so you can apply it to your own diagnostic and preventative practice.
Precisely. We just follow the data. So before we can build a structural framework to prevent violence, we have to define its boundaries.
We have to measure its global footprint.
Right. Because in epidemiology, you can't manage what you don't measure. We need to know the incidence, which is the rate of new violent events occurring in a specific time frame.
And the prevalence too,
Yes.
right?
Exactly. The total burden of violence existing in a population at any given time.
But how do we even define what counts as interpersonal violence in a way that allows for, like, consistent global data collection?
It is tricky.
Because what counts as violence in one culture might be considered standard disciplinary practice in another. It is an incredibly broad, slippery term.
It really is, which is why the World Health Report on Violence in Health gives us a very robust, standardized categorization to work from.
Okay, let's hear it.
It breaks interpersonal violence down into 5 main epidemiological areas. We have child maltreatment, youth violence, intimate partner violence, which we will frequently just call IPV sexual violence, and elder abuse.
Okay, let's pause and interrogate these categories for a second. Because when I first read that list, my immediate clinical instinct was to put them into neat little demographic silos.
Oh, like assigning them to different hospital
Yeah,
departments.
exactly. Like child maltreatment belongs to the pediatricians, IPV belongs in the adult OBGYN or primary care clinics, and elder abuse belongs to geriatrics.
Right.
But the text makes a very specific point about differentiation here, warning us against doing exactly that. These categories are not strictly bound by age, gender, or location, are they?
Not at all. And siloing them is a massive operational failure in health
Yeah,
systems.
so.
Well, in cultures or specific geographic settings that have a high baseline tolerance for violence, what epidemiologists actually call a high violence threshold, that aggression does not stay neatly contained behind closed doors in the home or on the schoolyard.
It spills over.
Exactly. It acts like a gas, it expands to fill the container. Adults of all ages might routinely use physical force to resolve a minor dispute with a neighbor over property.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. It bleeds into workplaces, it permeates prison systems, and yes, as many of you listening know all too well, it bleeds right into our hospitals.
Ugh. Manifesting as violence between patients or violence directed at healthcare staff.
Right. It is a generalized behavioral mechanism for conflict resolution that just completely saturates the entire environment.
And the sheer scale of this saturation is staggering when you look at the global burden, both in terms of mortality and the economic hemorrhage it causes to health systems.
The numbers are intense.
Let's look at them. According to the textbook's data from 2004, interpersonal violence was the 22nd leading cause of death globally.
Which accounts for roughly 1% of all global mortality.
Now, 1% might sound small in the grand scheme of cardiovascular disease or infectious outbreaks, but it is massive.
It really is.
And here is where it gets highly clinically relevant. If you zoom in on the 15 to 44 age group, violence suddenly jumps to become a leading cause of mortality.
It is entirely wiping out the prime years of human life.
Right. We are talking about the demographic that is supposed to be entering the workforce, raising families, and contributing to the community.
And when you selectively eliminate that age bracket, the economic and social cost that follows is just catastrophic.
The financial numbers are almost hard to fathom. Frankly, they should make any health system administrator sweat.
Oh, definitely.
The text cites that the total cost of violence in England and Wales was estimated at an astonishing $40.2 billion annually.
Wow.
And intimate partner violence alone was estimated to cost £15 billion in 2009.
That is just incredible.
We aren't just talking about the cost of sutures and ICU beds. We are talking about money drained from chronic care budgets, massive losses in economic productivity, policing costs.
Not to mention the burden on the judicial system and overwhelmed social services.
Exactly. Every dollar spent treating a preventable gunshot wound is a dollar not spent on preventative care or oncology.
Exactly. But mortality and economic cost are just the final outcomes. To really understand the burden, we need an epidemiological snapshot of the prevalence.
Like who's actually experiencing this day to day?
Right. Let's start with intimate partner violence. Globally, the textbook notes a staggering 30% of women aged 15 and over have experienced physical or sexual IPV.
Nearly 1 in 3 women globally. I mean, that means in any busy waiting room, statistically, multiple women sitting there are actively experiencing this.
Yes. But that global average hides massive, deeply informative regional variations.
Oh, like what?
The prevalence ranges from about 23% in high-income regions to 37% in places like the African and Eastern Mediterranean region.
That is a huge jump.
It is. And the ultimate tragic endpoint of this prevalence is that IPV accounts for 36% of all female homicides globally.
Over a third of all female homicides are committed by an intimate partner. That is incredibly grim.
It is.
But let's look at non-partner sexual violence, because the data here really made me stop and reevaluate my assumptions.
Yeah, the global estimate for women experiencing non-partner sexual violence is 7.2%.
Okay.
But Rachel Jukes does something vital in this chapter. She flips the epidemiological lens to look at the prevalence of perpetration, not just victimization.
Which makes sense. You can't prevent a disease if you only study the host. You have to study the pathogen.
Exactly. This is crucial for upstream prevention. When researchers look at perpetration in specific settings like parts of South Africa and Papua New Guinea, 20 to 40% of men surveyed reported having raped a female non-partner.
Wait, I have to stop you there. 20 to 40%.
Yes.
How do researchers even collect that data? How do you get 4 out of 10 men in a community to willingly admit to a felony on a public health survey?
It is a brilliant question about methodology.
Because as a clinician, getting patients to admit to minor diet infractions is hard enough.
I know, right? But these aren't casual street corner surveys. These are highly structured, anonymized, often computer-assisted self-interviews.
Oh, so they aren't talking to a person.
Right. The respondent is alone with an audio headset, removing the judgment of a human interviewer.
That makes sense.
But more importantly, the fact that men will disclose this behavior to researchers tells us something profound about the environment. It tells us that in these specific settings, the behavior is so deeply normalized, so stripped of its cultural stigma, that perpetrators don't even conceptualize it as a horrific crime to be hidden.
Oh, wow.
They view it as a standard expression of masculinity.
That forces you to completely abandon the lone psychopath theory.
Absolutely.
If 40% of a demographic is engaging in a behavior, it isn't the work of a few anomalous, mentally ill individuals. It is a systemic, structural feature of that society.
Exactly.
What about the prevalence in the other categories, like child abuse and youth violence?
For child maltreatment, looking at high-income countries where reporting mechanisms are stronger, 4 to 16% of children are physically abused annually.
That is still so high.
And over the course of their entire childhood, up to 40% are exposed to some form of sexual abuse or severe maltreatment.
And youth violence.
The global homicide rate is 9.2 per 100,000. But again, the geographic variance is wild.
I'm guessing it's lower in high-income areas?
It's much lower. It is 0.9 in high-income countries, compared to a staggering 36.4 per 100,000 in Latin America.
Wow.
And this specific category is heavily skewed toward young males, both as the perpetrators and the victims.
Got it. And elder abuse. I noticed that's the last category on the WHO list, and frankly, in clinical training, it seems to get the least attention unless there are obvious unexplained bruises.
It is severely under-researched globally. Part of the problem is classification.
What do you mean?
Well, elder abuse is frequently conflated with intimate partner violence. For instance, is it simply a case of IPV that has continued for 40 years into old age?
Oh, I see.
Or is it a new pattern of violence specifically targeting the new physical and cognitive vulnerabilities of the elderly patient?
That's a really important clinical distinction.
It is. The data shows the primary perpetrators are typically family members and caregivers, often driven by extreme caregiver burnout, financial exploitation, or lack of systemic support.
Which is a whole different etiology.
Exactly. Interestingly, the text also mentions very specific, culturally bound presentations of this.
Like what?
Such as witchcraft-related violence and murders, specifically targeting vulnerable elderly women in parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
Wait, really?
Yes, often as a means of resource confiscation disguised of spiritual cleansing.
Wow. Okay, so we have measured the immediate trauma. We have established the staggering incidence and prevalence of the violence itself.
We have.
But as clinicians, we need to move from the physical injury to the long-term systemic health outcomes.
Right. How does this exposure biologically, psychologically, and socially alter the entire trajectory of a patient's life?
Exactly. And this brings us to a really vital and often misunderstood intersection in the textbook, the link between gender-based violence and HIV.
This intersection is a perfect textbook example of systems impact. Violence isn't just a trauma issue. It is an infectious disease vector.
Let's unpack that.
Rachel Jukes details 4 distinct key dimensions linking gender inequity, gender-based violence, and HIV risk.
Let's go through this carefully because my first clinical thought, and the thought of most medical students, goes straight to the mechanics of direct transmission.
Right, the biological pathway.
Yeah. If a woman presents after a sexual assault, what is the actual biological risk of acquiring HIV directly from that single violent act?
It is a completely logical clinical question. Biologically, direct viral transmission from a single act of rape is entirely possible.
Especially in certain regions.
Yes, in high prevalence areas, a significant percentage of perpetrators may be HIV positive. And the trauma of forced sex often causes mucosal microtears, which dramatically increases the efficiency of viral entry.
That makes sense biologically.
However, from a population-level epidemiological standpoint, direct transmission from the assault itself isn't the primary engine driving the HIV epidemic among these women.
It isn't.
No. The assault is usually a single exposure, and the transmission risk per individual act, even with microtrauma, is relatively low.
So what is the real engine?
The real engine driving the exponential HIV risk is systemic and behavioral.
And that systemic engine leads right into the second dimension, the inability to protect oneself. The
Exactly.
text explicitly discusses how women facing severe gender inequity and physical threat simply cannot negotiate condom use. I actually like to conceptualize this clinically as a coerced agenda.
A coerced agenda. I like that.
Yeah, because when you have a patient sitting in front of you with recurrent STIs, the biomedical model says just give them antibiotics, offer condoms, and counsel them on safe sex.
Which is totally inadequate here.
Completely, because if that woman is trapped in a violent relationship, she is submitting to a male-dominated agenda just to survive the next 12 hours.
Right.
When you are just trying to avoid getting a broken jaw, advocating for your own long-term sexual health, or demanding your partner wear a condom isn't just difficult, it is practically impossible and potentially lethal.
Her bodily autonomy and self-care get entirely overwritten by immediate survival. That coerced agenda is a brilliant way to frame it for clinical practice.
It really completely removes the personal agency that standard public health messaging relies on.
You can't educate someone out of a hostage situation.
Exactly. Okay, what about the third dimension?
The third dimension looks at what we call the childhood trauma pathways. This is where we see the incredibly long tail of violence.
The long tail, right?
Epidemiological data clearly shows that women who experience sexual abuse or severe maltreatment in childhood have a sustained, elevated risk of HIV acquisition well into adulthood.
And why is that?
Because the severe childhood trauma leads to insecure attachment, emotional neglect, and profound, often untreated PTSD.
Which alters their development.
Yes. These psychological scars alter brain chemistry and self-worth, manifesting in long-term coping and risk behaviors.
Like what kind of behaviors?
Such as seeking out multiple or concurrent partners for validation, engaging in transactional sex to survive, or falling into severe substance abuse to numb the trauma.
Oh, I see. So the childhood abuse is the upstream structural cause, and the HIV infection 3 decades later is the downstream clinical outcome. It is a tragic, slow-motion cascade. We were treating the HIV, but the actual pathogen was the abuse 30 years ago.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
What is the fourth dimension?
The fourth dimension focuses entirely on the perpetrator risk profile.
Okay, turning the lens back to the men.
Right. The societal ideals of marked gender hierarchy that legitimize violence against women also simultaneously promote hyper-masculine ideals for men.
Ideals like what?
Ideals that emphasize toughness, risk-taking, and having multiple sexual partners as a literal badge of honor.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Consequently, violent men often engage in highly risky, unprotected sexual practices across multiple networks.
Which compounds the risk for the victim.
Massively. This means that a woman with a violent partner isn't just fundamentally unable to negotiate condom use. She is also facing a mathematically much higher exposure to HIV per sexual act simply because of her partner's extensive high-risk sexual network.
It is a perfect, inescapable storm of biological vulnerability and social risk.
It really is.
And these systemic health consequences don't stop at infectious diseases like HIV. The reproductive and mental health outcomes of violence are immense and burden every specialty in the hospital.
Yes, the text lists some stark, undeniable clinical outcomes.
Right, like women experiencing IPV have a 16% increased risk of having a low birth weight baby, likely due to chronic stress and physical trauma.
And a twofold increased risk of induced abortion.
And we must emphasize the massive mental health burden, particularly the differentiation the text makes between overt physical trauma and chronic emotional neglect.
Right, because in the ER or the pediatric clinic, we tend to hyper-focus on the physical bruises, the burns, the fracture.
Because we can see them, we can image them, and we can document them easily.
Exactly. But the text notes that emotional neglect in childhood, the chronic withholding of affection, safety, and validation, heavily drives the rates of clinical depression, suicidality, and drug and alcohol abuse in adolescence.
The psychological scaffolding of the child just quietly crumbles while we were looking for bruises.
That is so true. And regarding direct psychological trauma, it is vital for clinicians to note that rape has the highest likelihood of causing post-traumatic stress disorder of any violence exposure studied.
Wait, higher than combat?
Yes. The PTSD conversion rate for rape is higher than for combat exposure and higher than for surviving major natural disasters.
That is profound to think about. So let's look at the big picture here.
Okay.
If we are reviewing a patient's comprehensive medical chart, and we see this clustering, we see a history of childhood fractures, a recent presentation for intimate partner violence, and maybe an assault charge of their own.
Right, a very mixed picture.
Or we look at a perpetrator's rap sheet and see wildly varied offenses. We have to ask the epidemiological question. Why does violence cluster?
Because it certainly doesn't distribute evenly.
Right. And this brings us to Section 3 of our conceptual map, pattern recognition.
The clinical and academic term for this clustering is polyperpetration.
Polyperpetration.
Yes. The textbook makes it explicitly clear that these different forms of violence, the WHO categories we outlined earlier, are profoundly interconnected. They are not separate diseases.
So they feed into each other.
Exactly. The aggressive young boy who brutally bullies peers at school frequently becomes the teenager who gets into severe street fights and gang violence.
Who then becomes the adult who abuses his intimate partner, beats his own children, and perhaps participates in random community violence.
Yes, it is a single thread woven through different stages of life.
It's the exact same person, just aging into different arenas of violence, utilizing different victims based on access and power dynamics.
Perfectly tells of that.
Now, the text offers 4 distinct, interconnected explanations for why this clustering, this polyperpetration, happens so reliably. Number 1 is overlapping root causes.
Basically, the exact same foundational risk factors like extreme poverty, systemic inequality, or childhood trauma breed multiple violent outcomes.
Right. If the soil is toxic, everything that grows in it is poisoned.
Precisely. Explanation number 2 is social learning and the transferability of behavior.
I think of this clinically like a toolkit.
A toolkit? Tell me more.
Well, if you grow up in an environment, say a deeply disadvantaged neighborhood, where physical violence successfully and reliably solves conflicts in the street.
Like if punching someone gets you respect or secures your property.
Exactly. You learn very quickly that violence is a highly effective functional tool. So naturally, as an adult, you bring that exact same functional tool into your living room to resolve a marital dispute with your spouse.
Or you bring it into your parenting style to resolve a discipline issue with your toddler.
You use the tools you know work.
That is a grim but highly accurate analogy. The third explanation for clustering is cultural thresholds.
Which we touched on a bit earlier.
Right. Some societies simply have a hair trigger for violence across all domains of life. If the cultural threshold for using physical force is low everywhere, in the media, in the schools, in the state's use of force, you will see high rates of all types of interpersonal violence simultaneously.
That makes total sense. And what's the fourth?
The fourth explanation is vulnerability cycles.
Vulnerability cycles.
Yeah.
This is the tragic compounding reality that victimization inherently creates disempowerment.
Exactly.
If a child is physically disabled or deeply impoverished or has already been sexually abused, their perceived and actual disempowerment makes them a beacon for future predation.
They are seen as safe targets.
Right. One form of violence creates a physical or psychological vulnerability that actively invites future, varied forms of violence from opportunists.
Exactly. So, to truly understand these overlapping root causes and vulnerability cycles, we need to build what public health professionals call an ecological framework.
Right, layering it out.
We are going to zoom all the way into the microscopic level of the individual patient and then build our framework outward, layer by layer.
We move from the individual to the relational, to the community, to the societal.
And at every level, we trace the epidemiological path. Risk leads to exposure, exposure leads to outcome.
So let's zoom all the way in. Section 4. Individual risk factors. We're talking about the basic biology and genetics of the patient.
The text specifically highlights the MAOA gene.
What's fascinating here is how often this gets misunderstood in pop science. What does this gene actually do functionally in the brain?
Well, the MAOA gene encodes the monoamine oxidase A enzyme. This enzyme has a very specific job. It is responsible for metabolizing or clearing out and inactivating key neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft of the brain.
Specifically serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine.
Yes. We know that certain functional polymorphisms, genetic variations, result in significantly lower activity of this enzyme.
Meaning they don't do their job as well.
Right. This means those neurotransmitters aren't cleared out as effectively. They pool and linger in the brain, altering mood regulation, impulse control, and response to stimuli.
Okay, I have to push back hard here. Because as a clinician, whenever genetics and criminal behavior or violence come up in the same sentence, people immediately get very determinist.
Well, for sure. It's a dangerous path.
It borders on eugenics if we aren't careful. So is violence just genetic destiny? If a patient has this low-activity MAOA gene polymorphism, Are they biologically doomed to be a violent offender?
Absolutely not. And this is a foundational, non-negotiable concept in modern epidemiology, the gene-environment interaction.
You cannot look at the genotype in isolation.
Never. The textbook cites a highly famous prospective longitudinal study from New Zealand, often referred to as the Caspi study.
Oh, I know that one. They followed a massive cohort of children into adulthood.
Right. It showed that males with low MAOA enzyme activity did indeed have a statistically higher risk of developing antisocial and violent behavior, but only if they also experienced severe childhood maltreatment.
So it requires both elements to catalyze.
Exactly.
I like to picture the genetic polymorphism as pinder, dry, highly flammable wood. It's dangerous, sure, it has potential energy, but without a spark, it just sits there harmlessly.
That is a brilliant way to picture it.
The severe childhood maltreatment, the abuse, the trauma, that is the environmental spark. Without that specific environmental spark, the genetic tinder never catches fire.
That is a perfect, clinically sound analogy. The text explicitly points out that without the harsh, abusive environment, the genetic susceptibility simply does not express itself as aggression. The phenotype remains dormant.
That's incredibly reassuring, actually.
And while we are on the topic of biology, we must rigorously debunk a few persistent, damaging myths.
Yes, please.
The textbook makes a very clear point to state that the scientific evidence linking testosterone levels or generalized traumatic brain injury to population-level sexual offending is incredibly weak to non-existent.
That is vital to remember. We can't just casually blame hormones or say boys will be boys,
Right.
or blame vague head injuries for massive population-level trends in gender-based violence. The
Yeah.
data just doesn't support it.
It really doesn't.
So, if the environment provides this spark that ignites the biology, what does that early environment actually look like? This brings us to John Bowlby's attachment theory, which every pediatrician and psychiatrist knows intimately.
Bowlby's work is central to understanding the etiology of violence.
Right.
In a healthy environment, if a child's primary caregiver provides consistent, safe, and predictable responses to the child's needs, the child forms a secure attachment.
They learn to trust the world.
Exactly. To regulate their own emotions, to communicate their needs verbally, and to seek intimacy safely.
But if that early caregiving is highly unstable, violent, or profoundly neglectful, the child fails to form those secure neural and emotional bonds.
And the text highlights something really chilling, a specific clinical presentation called disorganized attachment.
Oh yes. This happens when a child receives harsh, unpredictable physical punishment mixed with confusing expressions of deep affection from the exact same parent.
Right, it's a total paradox for them.
The child's developing brain literally cannot process the contradiction. The person who is biologically supposed to be their ultimate source of safety and comfort is simultaneously their ultimate source of terror and pain.
Exactly. It creates a complete short circuit in the child's threat response system.
And what's the long-term clinical outcome of that disorganized attachment?
It creates an adult who fundamentally fears intimacy, expects chronic emotional deprivation, and deeply distrusts the motives of others.
Because they learned early on that their needs will never be met through normal, healthy communication.
Right. So they learn to bypass communication entirely. They use coercion, whether that is severe emotional manipulation or outright physical violence, to force others to meet their needs.
So you take that disorganized attachment, you take that fundamental inability to empathize or trust, and you see how it radically shapes adult personality. Which brings us to the concept of psychopathy.
Here, we must carefully differentiate between clinical psychopathy and subclinical traits.
Right, they aren't the same thing.
Clinical psychopathy, which is formally characterized by a complete pathological lack of empathy, an absence of remorse, and profound egocentricity, is found in roughly 1% of the general population.
These individuals treat other human beings entirely as objects to be used.
Yes. But the textbook notes that if we want to prevent population-level violence, we shouldn't just hyper-focus on that rare 1%. We need to look at subclinical traits that are far more pervasive.
Things like Machiavellian ecocentricity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is basically the worldview that the ends justify the means and my desires are the center of the universe.
In a profound blame externalization, right?
Yeah.
Where the narrative is always, it is never my fault, you provoked me, you made me hit you.
Yes, exactly. The text points out that these subclinical traits heavily correlate with rape perpetration in seemingly normal general populations, like college students.
It really highlights the uncomfortable truth that you do not need a full clinical diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder to exhibit traits that severely elevate your risk of perpetrating horrific violence.
It really does. And the final individual level factor we must discuss are the catalysts, mainly substance abuse.
Which do not necessarily create the drive for violence, but they act as powerful chemical accelerators.
Alcohol is the undisputed heavyweight here.
Yeah, from a physiological standpoint, it reduces cortical inhibition, it severely heightens emotional irritability, and it impairs executive reasoning.
But there was a very specific, terrifying detail in the text regarding the dynamics of alcohol that really stood out.
What was that?
If the perpetrator is heavily intoxicated but the victim is completely sober, the rates of severe physical injury and the actual completion of the sexual assault are statistically higher than if both parties were drinking.
Wow. It is a terrifying, highly lethal dynamic. You have the impaired, completely disinhibited aggression of the perpetrator meeting the acute, panicked awareness of the victim.
But the victim is physically overpowered by the sheer uncoordinated force and lack of restraint of the attacker.
That is awful. And regarding other illicit drugs, like marijuana, the text makes a very important epidemiological distinction.
It frames them not necessarily as direct chemical drivers of violence, the way alcohol chemically disinhibits the brain, but rather as social markers.
Meaning what, exactly?
High drug use often indicates active engagement in delinquent, marginalized subcultures where physical violence is already an established, normalized method of conflict resolution.
Right, so smoking marijuana isn't biochemically turning them into a violent offender. It's a proxy indicator.
Exactly.
It tells us that they are likely moving in a peer group where breaking societal rules, engaging in illicit markets, and using force is standard operating procedure.
Which acts as the perfect conceptual bridge to Section 5, the ecological framework at the relational and microsocial levels.
Because a biologically susceptible individual carrying genetic tinder sparked by childhood trauma and drinking alcohol does not exist in a vacuum.
Right. How do they behave when placed in a peer group or a romantic relationship?
Let's start with romantic relationships and the inevitability of conflict. Every couple experiences conflict.
But the text explains that poor communication skills, which are often deeply rooted in that disorganized, insecure attachment we just discussed, escalate routine, everyday domestic conflicts into physical violence.
And what specifically triggers that rapid escalation? The text points out it is very often when traditional gender privileges or roles are challenged.
Yes.
Like if a man feels his societal role as the primary provider or the unquestioned head of the household is threatened, maybe because of sudden unemployment, grinding poverty, or simply a vocal disagreement from his partner.
And he lacks the emotional regulation and communication skills to navigate that profound insecurity.
Exactly. He defaults to the only toolkit he trusts: physical violence to forcibly reestablish dominance and control.
That intense need for dominance and control is often deeply reinforced by the individual's peer networks. This brings us to a crucial sociological concept: homophily in friend groups.
Homophily, the idea that birds of a feather flock together.
Why?
It raises the classic chicken or egg question that every parent worries about.
Yeah.
Do naturally violent kids actively seek out other violent kids to form a gang? Or do inherently good kids slowly turn violent because they happen to hang around bad friends?
The textbook cites a fascinating, rigorously designed longitudinal study from Chile by a researcher named Steglick to answer this exact question.
And what did they find?
It turns out it is a bit of a tragic, self-reinforcing feedback loop. Children do not necessarily select their friends initially based on shared aggression.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But aggressive, poorly regulated kids quickly face mutual rejection from their non-aggressive, pro-social peers. They are ostracized.
Ah, so they are essentially forced together by exclusion.
Yes. Once they are isolated in that closed system of a delinquent peer group, the similarity in their violent behavior is actually a product of the friendship itself.
Violence becomes highly contagious within the peer group. It becomes the sole currency of respect and belonging.
And that ties directly into the power of social learning. Knowing a perpetrator intimately normalizes the violent act.
Right. The text mentions that sexually abusive adolescents very often had prior, extensive exposure to inappropriate sexualization in their environment.
Or they personally knew adults who were known or suspected sexual abusers.
It completely removes the societal taboo. If your friends, your older brothers, or your role models do it and face no consequences, the internal psychological boundary of what is considered unthinkable simply vanishes.
Exactly. The unthinkable becomes routine. So now we must zoom out again.
From the individual to the relationship to the community.
Section 6, community dynamics. What are the macro structures, the neighborhood realities, that allow these violent peer groups to thrive in the first place?
Well, the most obvious and pervasive one is poverty and structural disadvantage. Poverty creates massive chronic economic strain.
It crushes the traditional male provider role, fueling deep feelings of inadequacy and shame.
And street gangs step right into that structural void. They offer power, social status, and illicit economic opportunity in environments where the legitimate economic system offers absolutely none.
But the textbook offers a brilliant, highly nuanced, and deeply counterintuitive finding regarding poverty and single perpetrator rape, drawing on data from South Africa.
Yes, this completely blew my mind and challenged my own clinical assumptions.
Let's hear it.
You would naturally think that the absolute poorest of the poor, those with the most severe material deprivation, would have the highest rates of offending across the board.
Right, that's the usual assumption.
But the data showed that among impoverished populations, it is very often the relatively less poor, the men who have a slightly more advantaged position within a deeply disadvantaged community, who are statistically more likely to commit single perpetrator rape.
How do the researchers unpack the structural psychology of that?
The authors argue it is fundamentally about a perverse sense of thwarted entitlement.
Thwarted entitlement.
Yeah. The specific individual has a slight relative advantage over his neighbors, maybe a bit more education, or a slightly better job. So he has been socialized to feel entitled to societal power, respect, and material success.
But he still lives in a broader structural environment where true systemic material success or political power is completely impossible to attain due to systemic racism or macroeconomic collapse.
Exactly. So that intensely thwarted entitlement, that furious frustration of being denied what he feels he is owed, gets acted out violently on the bodies of women.
Wow.
The sexual violence acts as a toxic, destructive substitute for the structural power he cannot achieve.
It is the tragedy of relative deprivation weaponized against the vulnerable. And that leads us directly to what I consider the most vital, illuminating concept in this entire chapter, cultural scaffolding.
Oh, coined by Nicola Gavey, right.
Yes.
I cannot emphasize enough how crucial this concept is for our listeners, especially if you are working in emergency medicine or psychiatry. Think about literal scaffolding.
Okay.
Scaffolding is what you put up around a building while you are constructing it or while you are repairing a crumbling facade. The scaffolding structurally holds the building up, but crucially, it also hides the true shape and condition of the building from the people walking on the street below.
I love that visual. And culturally, this scaffolding consists of pervasive rape myths, deeply held ideas of conjugal rights and male ownership in marriage.
And societal norms that celebrate harsh physical discipline of children.
Exactly. This cultural scaffolding operates as a cognitive shield.
Right. It allows a man to sexually coerce his partner, pin her down, and genuinely think to himself, I am not a rapist. Rapists are monsters hiding in alleys. I am just a husband taking my conjugal rights.
Or it allows a parent to beat a terrified child with a belt and think, I am not a child abuser. I love my child. I am just instilling necessary discipline.
The scaffolding completely hides the horrific nature of the violence from the perpetrator's own conscience. It allows them to commit the act repeatedly without ever internalizing the identity of a criminal or a monster.
And when that cultural scaffolding is robust and unchallenged by the community, the motivations for extreme violence can become incredibly, chillingly casual.
Yeah, the text highlights a deeply disturbing motive that emerged in the data. Entertainment.
It is so unsettling.
In a multi-country Asia-Pacific study, a staggering 59% of men who admitted to raping a non-partner cited entertainment or fun as one of their primary motivations.
And in South Africa, nearly half of the perpetrators cited seeking fun or relieving boredom.
When half of your perpetrators are committing sexual violence for fun, you are clearly not dealing with a few isolated, biologically anomalous psychopaths.
You are dealing with a society where the cultural scaffolding has completely systematically normalized the predation of the vulnerable. It's treated like a sport.
And that brings us to the theoretical backbone of this entire section. Hegemonic masculinity, a concept theorized by the sociologist R.W. Connell.
Connell's theory is absolutely essential for public health trainees to grasp if they want to design effective interventions. Gender identities and expectations are not just biological defaults handed down by nature.
They are actively socially constructed, and crucially, they are arranged hierarchically.
Exactly. Hegemonic masculinity is the reigning, dominant cultural ideal of manhood in any given society at a specific point in time.
And it is important to note, this hegemonic ideal varies globally. In some cultures, the hegemonic ideal of a man might be a wise, egalitarian peacemaker.
True. But in many global settings, and certainly in the settings with high violence prevalence we've discussed, this ideal demands stoic toughness, extreme emotional self-reliance,
A refusal to show vulnerability.
and above all else, absolute control over women and children.
And here is the systemic epidemiological mechanism. Where the cultural ideal of manhood strictly requires dominance, violence becomes a perfectly logical, legitimate, socially sanctioned tool to achieve and maintain that required status.
If society tells you that you are only a real man if you are in total control and you suddenly feel you are losing control due to poverty, or a partner asserting independence,
Violence is the quickest mechanism you have to forcefully reclaim your identity and your status in the hierarchy.
it connects everything. It connects the violence between men-like brutal bar fights to prove toughness and defend honor directly to the violence against women in the home. It is the exact same underlying drive to achieve and defend hegemonic status.
Wow. So we've traced the path from the mutated gene to the abusive family to the ostracized peer group to the toxic community norms. Now, Section 7, the societal level.
We reach the widest possible lens.
Right. The state, the government, and the law. How does societal governance either codify this violence into the system or effectively disrupt it?
It ultimately comes down to institutions and the promise of impunity. We talked extensively about cultural scaffolding. Well, the formal laws of a nation are the steel girders holding that scaffolding up.
Patriarchal values and power imbalances get baked directly into a nation's legal code.
Yes. The text gives very clear historical and contemporary examples of this structural codification, like a lack of marital rape laws, meaning a husband legally, by definition, cannot rape his wife, no matter the force used.
Or poor property inheritance and divorce rights for women, meaning a woman literally cannot leave a highly abusive husband because the state ensures she will be left entirely destitute and unable to feed her children.
But the textbook also notes that even when a country passes highly progressive laws on the books, perhaps due to international pressure, the institutions tasked with enforcing them often quietly maintain the old scaffolding.
Oh, for sure. If a woman bravely reports domestic violence, but the police refuse to open a formal case, or if the judicial courts have an incredibly predictably low prosecution and conviction rate for sexual assault,
It sends a deafening, unmistakable message to the perpetrators. It promises systemic impunity.
it says the paper law might say this is illegal, but the actual living system says we agree with you and we won't stop you.
Exactly. And societal governance doesn't just regulate the punishment of violence, it also actively regulates the catalysts of violence we discussed earlier.
Right, the state has the power to regulate exposures. If a local government allows incredibly cheap, highly concentrated, unregulated alcohol to be sold 24 hours a day on every single corner in a disadvantaged neighborhood, they are structurally engineering an increase in the incidence of violent conflict.
They are pouring gasoline on the tinder.
And then there's the ultimate catalyst, the regulation of firearms.
The textbook provides a very stark, undeniable policy contrast here.
Yeah, it highlights South Africa, which, facing a massive crisis, implemented significantly stricter national gun control legislation.
And over the following decade, that single macro policy change correlated with a nearly 50% reduction in female gun-related homicides.
Half the mortality wiped out by a single legislative stroke. A massive, undeniable public health victory.
Contrast that with the United States, as the textbook explicitly does, noting its exceptionally high firearm homicide rate.
Which is structurally driven by liberal gun laws and easy access to lethal means. The state's regulation of lethal tools directly and mathematically dictates the final mortality rate of interpersonal conflict.
The intent to harm might be the same, but the tool determines if it's an ER visit or a trip to the morgue.
Which brings us finally to Section 8, Upstream Engineering, the Prevention Challenge. We've mapped the toxic river all the way from the state legislature down to the individual's neurotransmitters.
So how does public health actually step in and engineer a solution?
Well, the textbook lays out three main avenues for primary prevention. And remember, primary prevention means stopping the violence before it ever occurs, not just treating the aftermath.
Right. Avenue 1 is reducing perpetration risk right at the source, early life.
This means intervening structurally before the disorganized attachment ever has a chance to form.
It involves funding programs that strengthen parenting skills, aggressively treating maternal depression so mothers can safely and warmly bond with their infants.
And implementing absolute supported zero-tolerance policies for bullying and corporal punishment in school systems. The host environment of the developing brain must be kept safe.
The text also mentions specific evidence-based programs aimed at fundamentally reshaping those toxic masculinities we talked about, like the Stepping Stones program.
You have to actively teach young men before they solidify their identities that there are ways to achieve status, respect, and self-worth that do not involve dominance, aggression, or the subjugation of women.
Exactly. Then, Avenue 2 is empowerment and norm shifting.
This is the hard work of dismantling the cultural scaffolding. A prime example cited in the text is the image study in South Africa,
Which brilliantly combine microfinance and economic empowerment for women alongside targeted gender equity training.
If you give a woman independent economic leverage, you give her the actual practical power to escape a violent relationship.
You sever the vulnerability cycle.
You change the power dynamic fundamentally, because she no longer relies on the perpetrator for survival.
And Avenue 3 is strengthening structures.
This is the macro, state level, enforcing the progressive laws that are already on the books.
Reforming police training and response protocols so victims actually trust the system enough to report.
And tightly regulating those lethal catalysts, restricting alcohol density and implementing rigorous firearm controls.
Now, if you are listening to all of this and you are feeling completely overwhelmed by the sheer interlocking scale of the problem, if it feels impossible to fix,
The chapter ends with a truly powerful case for hope, and it uses massive epidemiological data from the United States to prove its point.
it is a fascinating, highly encouraging epidemiological mystery. Over the 20 years leading up to the data analyzed in the text, the U.S. saw a massive, unprecedented decline in interpersonal violence across the board.
Child maltreatment dropped by 40 to 70%, intimate partner violence dropped by 49%, and between 1990 and 2010, the national homicide rate literally halved.
So the obvious million-dollar clinical question is, which specific intervention worked?
Was it better police tactics?
Yes.
Was it the reduction in lead exposure? Was it poverty reduction? Was it the rise of domestic violence awareness campaigns?
And the consensus answer from criminologists and public health researchers is we aren't entirely sure which single factor was the magic bullet, because there wasn't one.
And that is actually the most validating, profound part of the whole chapter.
Right, the fact that child abuse, IPV, and youth homicide all declined simultaneously in tandem proves the core thesis of this entire deep dive.
Interpersonal violence is deeply, fundamentally interconnected. It is the polyperpetration concept proven at a societal scale.
If you treat the whole ecosystem, if you reduce poverty, improve gender equity, remove lead from the environment, and regulate exposures, all types of violence recede together.
The entire river gets cleaner across the board.
It proves irrefutably that violence is not a biological inevitability. It is not an unavoidable facet of human nature. It is socially engineered, and therefore it can be systematically socially re-engineered.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you head back to the clinic, the ward, or the classroom.
We have seen that interpersonal violence is heavily driven by cultural scaffolding, social learning, and systemic power imbalances. It is inherently preventable.
So if our clinical health systems only focus on treating the physical injuries, if we only act as secondary prevention, endlessly pulling drowning people out of the river delta, patching them up, and sending them back into the exact same toxic environment.
Are we inadvertently acting as a societal pressure valve?
Right. By quietly, efficiently absorbing the trauma and hiding the true cost of the violence inside our ERs, are we allowing a violent society to maintain its toxic status quo without ever being forced to change the upstream structures?
It is a deeply challenging ethical and professional question. Are we curing the disease, or are we just beautifully, efficiently managing the symptoms of a diseased society?
Something to think about next time you are charting a complex trauma case. All right, let's lock in this knowledge. It is time for our rapid single best answer recall prompts. This is where we test your active retention of the frameworks we just unpacked.
But we aren't going to just read them like a robotic exam. Let's frame these as clinical thought experiments.
Sounds good. I will lay out the scenario or the core concept, give you the options, and we will give you a beat. Use that time to commit to your clinical reasoning before we reveal the answer.
Question 1. Let's test your knowledge of the epidemiological boundaries. According to the WHO categorization strictly detailed in the text, which of the following is considered a distinct form of interpersonal violence? A. Self-harm. B. State-sponsored war. C. Intimate partner violence. Or D. Road traffic accidents. Take a second to think.
The answer is C, intimate partner violence. Self-harm is self-directed, war is collective, and accidents lack the intentionality defined by the WHO. For consolidation, revisit the introduction section of Chapter 9.5.
Question 2. Imagine you're explaining genetic risk to a concerned colleague. Which biological mechanism is most strongly supported by the text as interacting with severe childhood maltreatment to actively increase the risk of antisocial behavior? A. Elevated baseline testosterone. B. Generalized traumatic brain injury. C. Low MAOA enzyme activity. Or D. High baseline cortisol. Lock it in.
The answer is C, low MAOA enzyme activity. Remember the Caspi study? It is the genetic tinder requiring the environmental spark. Revisit the individual level genotype section.
Question 3. You are treating a female patient in the infectious disease clinic. In the context of HIV risk and violence, which of the following mechanisms accounts for the sustained, lifelong, elevated risk of HIV among women who experienced severe childhood sexual abuse? A. Direct viral transmission occurring during the childhood assault. B. The subsequent development of risky sexual practices and substance abuse as a coping mechanism for the trauma. C. A genetic immunodeficiency directly linked to early trauma exposure. Or D, the conscious, deliberate selection of HIV-positive partners. Think it through.
The answer is B. The trauma creates the psychological pathway for future behavioral risk. Revisit the health consequences section.
Question 4. You are observing a domestic violence case in the ER where the perpetrator seems entirely unbothered by his actions. What sociological term describes the protective social context, including prevalent rape myths and ideals of male entitlement, that allows this perpetrator to comfortably reconfigure sexually coercive behavior as acceptable? A. Hegemonic masculinity. B. Cultural scaffolding. C. Disorganized attachment. Or D. Subclinical psychopathy. Go ahead and answer.
The answer is B. Cultural scaffolding. It hides the violence from the perpetrator's own conscience. Revisit the community level social norms section.
Question 5. According to R.W. Connell-Skerry, which we discussed at length, what exactly is hegemonic masculinity? A. The proven biological superiority of males in physical combat. B. A genetically determined highly aggressive personality trait. C. The socially constructed dominant cultural ideal of manhood that gains its legitimacy through shared societal acceptance. Or D. The simple statistical majority of male behavior in a given society. Think back to our discussion.
The answer is C. It is a social construct, not a biological default, and it often demands dominance. Revisit the masculinity subsection under community level.
Final question. We discussed macro-level policy. The textbook cites which specific structural intervention in South Africa as directly contributing to a nearly 50% reduction in female gun-related homicides over a decade. A. Implementing mandatory minimum sentencing for domestic abuse. B. Enacting significantly tighter firearm control legislation. C. Rolling out widespread economic empowerment programs. Or D. The complete deregulation of the alcohol industry. What do you think?
The answer is B, tighter firearm control legislation.
Right.
Regulating the lethal catalyst saved lives. Revisit the societal level section.
Excellent work tracking with us today.
Keep looking upstream, keep questioning the structures, and don't just accept the trauma at the delta.
Here are the details of this episode.
Interpersonal violence.